In the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. I had a really powerful thought that is escaping me. And it's leading me into temptation, of the belief of unworthiness, of the belief that, life is a linear, straightforward path, and there are no which implies that there are no rulerships, there are no principalities, there are no dominions, of darkness in this world. Because that couldn't be further from the truth, because you can see in which how, not even how the world is, how people are. Because, you notice the dominions and the rulerships through the people and the functions of people, how people think, how people act, how people relate, how people believe, what people believe is right and what people believe is wrong. But I know, as a truth of fact that there's a principle, above all principle, a dominion, above all dominions, a being above all beings, that doesn't subscribe to what's been placed in front of it, but what is essentially true. And in truth, it's difficult for people to find truth, to know truth, to investigate, to search for themselves, that truth. Because the ways of the world, if left unchecked, we have a world like today, a prison that we believe is a paradise, and that God rewards, and that functions in its own way, and does its own thing, and has its own people, and has its own heavens, and has its own hells, and all those kinds of things. You would believe a lot of things, but that's just a reflection of who we've been as man, over the last, however long we've been here. Because our systems reflect people, our systems reflect thinkings, our systems reflect that which people are, and you see it in how people live, how people relate, how people connect, how people function. People function with different principles, and it's difficult to know the principles of people. It's best to know the principles of people by how people walk and function and move and stumble and fall and make mistakes and, grow and, find life and, find love and, find union, and that isn't something that someone can give you. That's not something that, is bought or sold. That isn't something that, is given or taken, because I wrestle not against flesh and bones, but spiritual wickedness in high places, where they are, almost like an ocean of changing states. Sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's still, sometimes it's moving. And I think the first, most important thing is to know yourself, know who you are. Know who you are in truth, know who you are in being, and don't subscribe to what people believe or what people know. Is self-honesty, or self-love, or to have that felt sense of love, or that felt sense of union. With self, because I found my way, I found my route, I found that living essence, that's been called so many things and so many names, just through connecting with the grass, connecting with the trees, connecting with the sky, connecting with myself, connecting with my voice, connecting with my mind, connecting with my heart. I found that lived, essence of truth, and to realize that I'm actually a living being, I'm actually here. This is actually not a dream, I'm actually alive. This is something that is actually truthful, something that is actually real, And that led me, across many cultures, across many religions, across many spiritualities. And it's just the same song, every culture, every religion that you see and that you view and that you know, it's just one truth, one being, one essence of life. that's been called many things, many names, many descriptions, many ways of seeing it, and it's a connection with something real, it's a connection with something everlasting. It's a connection with something that does not depend on anything but its own self. It's an ocean, and I found myself to be a falling drop from the sky, and then I merged with the entire ocean, and it's just so difficult to describe. And that isn't to say that I'm starting some kind of a religion, or I'm starting some kind of a faith or something, but it's just to say and just to confirm that all of the messengers, all of the humble servants of God, all of those beings who have embodied that living truth, as trees are living, as birds chirp, as the rain falls, as the sun sets and the sun rises, that living principle, that unifying isness, that unifying being, that unifying thing. That thing we call God, the infinite God, not the God of man as we've come to believe it, not the ways of man as we've come to know them, not the ways in which, people believe and the way in which people relate, but in that actual living presence, and I find my abode in that, I find my peace in that, I find my solace in that. And that's not to say that, people must worship me or, be on my knees and call me God and, call me King or call me the Messiah or call me anything, It's just to say that is a living thing. I found that, in me, in the world, in mind, in love, in life, in work, at church, in Hinduism, in Zen, it's everywhere. It's just one truth. It's just one being. It's just one message. Follow the way. Follow the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus said. And what he meant by is that I am that living embodiment of God. I am that living presence of God, that's found in everything. And like my struggle or my wrestle with, the principalities of the world is that, those principalities are not living principalities. They aren't principalities that are based in life, and the reason why I say that is because most of them are secret, But I found truth to be the most openly abundant thing. Why is life a secret? Why is trees a secret? Why is truth a secret? Why is love a secret? And I think it's a secret because, in the same way that you can say that I love you. There's no way that someone else can know that you love them, because it's something that you know and that you feel and that you share. With them, through your actions, but we are in an ocean of love, an infinite ocean of love, a never-ending ocean of love, an undying love, an ever-multiplying love that gives birth to ways, to people, to ideas, to trees, to animals, to people, to thoughts, to feelings, to connections, to music, to art, to the concepts that we have, you know. And that's not something that can be taken away. That's not something that can be given. It's something that can only be realized. You know, you only realize God. You don't make God. You know, you don't say that I am God, I am the most holy. You just realize that you've never not been God. You've never not been other than holy. And that's just the realization. That's just something that you see, you know. That's something in the world, but not of the world. And you know, I believe, you know, such an obvious fact, such an obvious being, such an obvious principle, you know, goes amiss because, you know, the world is pursuing other ends and other means other than the knowing of that being and the knowing of that presence, because with that knowing of that presence comes a shared sense of being, you know, Christ, you know. With that comes, you know, beings like Christ, beings like the Buddha, you know. Comes religion, you know, comes love, comes family, comes truth, comes peace. So many flies. You know, this is where my dog poops and stuff. You know, messages from God, we can say. You know, clean the yard more often, I would interpret. Because there's a true nature, you know, there's a true way of being and a true truth that, you know, belongs to every single one of us, that isn't dependent on the world or what you have or what you do, most importantly. Because a lot of people miss really great things in life, you know, a lot of people miss really beautiful and sacred connections because we watch too much what people do and we don't necessarily watch our inmost, you know, felt sense. And that doesn't mean, you know, to be okay with things that aren't okay, you know. It just means, you know, prioritize, you know, the place in which you stand, you know, prioritize in which way you place value, you know, prioritize where you know, what you make most important, you know, make that come first, make that, you know, utmost and first, you know, in being, because that's not even putting God first, because to even call it a word, you know, is to call it something that, you know, isn't actually true, because that, you know, that being is so ineffable, so vast, so peaceful, so blissful, you know, so love, so truthful, so kind, so calm, so still, you know, in its expression that, you know, we are, you know, I am. And 2,000 years ago, a man knew that truth. A man, knew that secret. And, dare I say, from the point of view of the authorities at that time, a man, knew that sin, because such truths were only available to the most powerful of beings. The emperors and the kings of the time. That, we are God, that every single living being is God. The man, about 2,000 years ago, knew that truth, knew that life, knew that way. And the reaction of the world at the time was to call him a blasphemer, call him a liar, call him a heretic, and not believe that he's the son of this undying presence, this undying truth, this undying knowing, this undying way. He was crucified, he was killed, he was hung on a cross. But 2,000 years later, there's a realization, there's a knowing, there's a confirmation that the message of the Christ is true. There's a confirmation that God without charge, God without asking, God without worship, God without being even acknowledged, is the giver of life, is the way, the truth, and the life. And that's something you can live today, That's something you can know today, that's something you can cherish today, that's something you can appreciate today, that's something you can love today. You can follow someone like the Christ, or follow someone like the Buddha, most importantly, because those were liberated beings. That's what we could call angels, angels in human form. The angels of truth, the angels of love, the angels of light, the angels of the way. The angels of the true and living God. Because you'll soon realize that most of this truth is hidden because there's a sense of envy, there's a sense of a lack of this inmost felt living presence and inmost felt living truth that people are aware of, because people will be amazed, find you such a mystery, find you such a paradox, find you such an anomaly, and they ask, what is it that that others don't know, and the simple answer to that comes from one of my teachers as well, is that I found my relationship with me, I found my relationship with self. And call that what you call it. Christ called it, I'm the Son of God. I think the Buddha said it. he's enlightened, he's liberated. Other traditions have called it, liberation, moksha. I struggle to define it. I struggle to put it in words. I struggle to give it a title, give it away, because what else is there? From that point of view. Because you can best see it. You can best know it. You can best see it, I would say, by its opposite. See it by all of the desires and the envies and the hatred and the fears and the confusion of the world. Is that people know something deep within themselves. Is something that every single being knows, but people don't know what they know. People don't know that they are in an infinite ocean of eternal living light, eternal living love. So we search for it in the world. We try and control, we try and rule, we try and dictate the way, we try and tell people what they are. We try, but I promise you it's not something you can do on your own. There's a mathematical formula that I discovered, or that I was shown. It shows that the limit as something, and by limit, when you stretch something to the furthest of its utmost end, to the stretch of the stretchiest stretch, to the furthest point that it can go. That limit of a being inside of God, or a being inside of truth, or a being inside of love, of which we all are, is infinite. You can mathematically show that, and you can mathematically prove that. And the thing about that limit is that it's impossible. You can't be nothing in something. You can't disappear. You can't be zero. You can't uncreate yourself. You can't not be. You always will be. You always will have a being. You always will have a presence. So then how do you become an infinite being? Let's call it infinite being, as Christ would call it, I'm the Son of God, or the Buddha would say, I'm liberated, How do you then become nothing in something? It's that you can't, And that's where you realize grace. That's where you realize the grace of God. That's where you realize the truth and the love and the light of God. Because only God can make God. Only God can choose God. Only Christ can choose Christ. Only the Buddha, can choose the Buddha. And what that means is that, through their lived life, through their living word, through their living witness, through their living testament, if you follow that way, not religiously, but earnestly, you follow that with an open heart, not as a command, but through love, through truth, through just pure beingness. Reach a certain point where your being becomes identical to the being of God. Your being becomes that truth of God. Your being becomes that love of God, then you reach that impossible state of being nothing in something, then you reach that impossible state of being invisible in God. But that invisibility in God doesn't make you disappear. That invisibility in God doesn't make you something else. That invisibility in God makes you God. It makes you infinite. All knowing, all powerful, all present. Life giving. That when you find yourself through everything and in everything. Because that's that living truth, that's being the Christ, that's being the Buddha, or rather that's embodying the Christ, that's embodying the Buddha, that's embodying freedom, that's embodying love, that's embodying light, that's embodying kindness, that's embodying warmth, that's embodying that living presence, that living being that we all find ourselves in. That's being life itself, in its infinite magnitude, in its infinite scale, in its infinite, potential, quite literally, it can be shown, And you will find, if you follow the way of the Christ, or the way of the Buddha, all the ways of freedom, all the ways of love, all the ways of light, you will find yourself at the right hand of God. A giving of infinite magnitude, a giving of unendingness. Something inside of you just gets potentiated it to such an extent that it defies words. It's ineffable. What a beautiful English word. Something that you cannot describe with words. And ever since I've known, ever since I've realized, ever since I've known God, the only thing that I wanted to do was to give God to others. The only thing that I wanted to do was to give back what was given to me, an unending, infinite supply, because that's one of the funny things about wrestling with darkness, is that their supply of what is true seems quite limited. I think their connection with the infinite isn't so infinite, because it's hoarded, it's controlled, it's limited, it's lacking. There's something missing in those ways. There's something missing in those, in that consciousness, we could say. Because the trickery, we could say, or the joke or the punchline of God was that he almost wants them to try and steal the message of the Christ or the Buddha or that living word or that living truth or that seeing, because he knows that he has an infinite supply of it. That's how I guess he gives it to them. Because it's so strange to realize, and it's so strange to know actually that why is something so vast hoarded, to what degree or to what extent have we placed ourselves here, or made ourselves or done any single one thing, just one single thing, to what extent have we done that? It's so funny. And then we come to the understanding that, as human beings, as a civilization, as a population, as all 8 billion of us, we are being given a choice. We are being given a choice between that which is finite and limited, and ending, and that which is infinite, everlasting, always present, always true. And what kind of a choice is that? It's not really a choice. It's just that people are distracted by their ways. People are distracted by the things they do. People are distracted by the things they think and who they associate with and what they associate themselves with. They don't associate themselves with life. They associate themselves with death. And that's an ending of being. That's we could say an impossibility. We could say, but that's an impossibility of God. But nothing is impossible to God. Nothing is impossible to the infinite. Because by definition, infinity includes all things, by right. And that's my wrestle, that's my match, that's my my fight, with the unseen forces of the world, which unknowingly and unconsciously link to the finite and the limited, and the unknowingness of the world, which link unknowingly, to death. Because you would think that death is something that's foreign to us, but it's not really. It's not foreign to life. It's not foreign to infinity. Because we could say that trees die, every season, and to grow again. That's that principle of life, is that it just becomes a cycle in itself. It grows, it disappears, it grows, it disappears, it changes with the movements and the ways of life. That's just how life functions. That's just how life evolves. That's just how God is. God isn't really trying to be God or to do something. God is just being God. God is just being life. God is just being truth. God isn't trying to rule or to organize or to be some kind of way, to be in some kind of fashion or some kind of things. I think those are the thoughts and the messages and the understandings of those who have not known the infinite magnitude of all that is. birds, the bees, and the trees. And the grace is that it's a living truth. It's a living way. It's a living understanding, and it's so big that you can miss it. That's why it requires your smallness. That's why it requires your nothingness. That's why it requires humility. And it's so organizing, so beautiful, because life is such a beautiful thing. And that's all of our being.